The sun was setting over Kumbele Village, casting a golden glow on the big family estate. Inside the dining hall, the long wooden table was filled with steaming dishes, the smell of spicy groundnut soup filling the air. Amina moved quietly between the chairs, her heart always careful not to offend anyone. She had lived here since her mother died, trying to keep her head down among relatives who never truly welcomed her. That evening, the family was in high spirits, laughing loudly as they ate. Amina carried a heavy pot of soup from the kitchen, her hands warm from the steam. Just as she reached the table, her foot caught the edge of a stool. The pot tipped. Thick, red soup spilled across the white tablecloth and splashed onto Madame Efua's expensive lace dress. The room fell silent. Madame Efua slowly stood up, her eyes sharp with anger. "Look at what you've done," she snapped, brushing at her stained clothes. A few cousins chuckled under their breath, while others shook their heads. "It was an accident," Amina said softly, but her voice was drowned by the noise. "Accident? This girl has no respect," someone muttered. "You've been living here for free, and this is how you repay us," another added. It was as if the soup had given them the reason they'd been waiting for. Voices rose, words cut deep, and Amina stood frozen, her cheeks burning. Finally, Madame Efua's voice sliced through the chaos. "Pack your things. By morning, you're gone." Amina swallowed hard. No one defended her. The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced by cold eyes watching her fade into the background. Tonight, she had lost her place in this house. The rain was falling hard, each drop cold and heavy against Amina's skin. She stood at the edge of the family compound, clutching a small, worn bag that held the few things she owned. Her clothes were already soaked through, but she didn't move. In her hand, wrapped in a piece of cloth to keep it dry, was the only thing that truly mattered to her, a faded photograph of her late grandfather, Kofi Mensah. He had been the only one who treated her like she belonged, the only one who looked at her with love instead of suspicion. The gate creaked shut behind her with a final, metallic clang. She turned and saw shadows moving in the nearby houses. Neighbors stood under their porches, whispering. Some stared with pity in their eyes, but said nothing. Others shook their heads and murmured that she had brought this on herself. No one stepped forward. No one offered shelter. The muddy road stretched ahead, the rain turning it into a river of brown water. She took her first step, her slippers sinking into the wet ground. Her hair clung to her face, her body trembling from the cold. Each step felt heavier than the last, but she kept walking. The village lights grew faint behind her as she made her way to the small rented room she had managed to keep with her meager earnings. By the time she reached it, her feet were numb, her dress clinging to her like a second skin. The room was barely big enough for a bed and a chair, but at least it was hers. She lit the small kerosene lamp and sat on the edge of the bed, unwrapping the photograph. She stared at her grandfather's kind smile, the warmth in his eyes, and felt her own tears mix with the rain still dripping from her hair. That night, as the storm raged outside, Amina made herself a promise. She would never go back to beg them for anything. Not food. Not shelter. Not love. They had shut the door on her, but she would find a way to build her own. And when she did, they would see, not her anger, but her strength. The mornings came early for Amina. Long before the sun rose, she was already at the roadside food stall, sleeves rolled up, hands deep in soapy water. The air smelled of fried plantain and sizzling fish, mixing with the dust of the waking village. Her work was simple but endless, washing greasy dishes, peeling buckets of vegetables, scrubbing cooking pots until her fingers ached. By midday, the heat from the fire and the smell of smoke clung to her skin, but she never complained. Every sadie she earned was carefully counted. She kept enough to pay her rent and buy food, and whatever remained, even if it was only a few coins, went to the village orphanage. They have less than me, she would tell herself as she dropped the money into an envelope. It didn't matter that she was struggling, she refused to let hardship turn her into someone bitter or selfish. People sometimes tried to get her to talk about her family, to hear her side of the story. But she never said a bad word about them. "What happened is in the past," she would simply reply, her voice calm. There was a quiet dignity in the way she carried herself, even when her clothes were worn and her shoes thin from walking. What Amina didn't know was that someone had been watching her for months. Across the street from the food stall, an elderly man often sat on a wooden bench, sipping tea from a metal cup. His name was Mr. Ababio, a retired lawyer known in Kumbele Village for his sharp mind and fair judgment. He had heard whispers about the girl who had been thrown out, yet chose to help others with the little she had. Each day, he watched the way she worked without complaint, the way she smiled at customers, the way she gave up her seat for elders. He noticed her strength, not the hardship around her. And though Amina didn't know it, her life was slowly being rewritten, not by pity, but by the quiet admiration of someone who saw her worth when others didn't. It was a quiet afternoon at the food stall when Amina heard the news. One of the village women, carrying a basket of tomatoes, stopped by and said softly, "Have you heard? Kofi Mensah has passed." The words felt like a stone dropping into her chest. She froze, her hands still wet from washing dishes. Her grandfather. The only person who had ever truly loved her. The man who had defended her when she was small, who had held her hand when her mother died, who had made her laugh even on her worst days. Gone. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped away from the stall, needing a moment to breathe. The world around her seemed to blur, the noise of passing cars, the smell of frying oil, even the sound of the stall owner calling her name. All she could hear was the echo of his warm voice in her mind. That night, in her small room, she sat on the bed with his photograph in her hands. She traced the lines of his face with her fingers, remembering the way he used to call her, "my little star." 1,000 memories flooded in, and with them came the sharp sting of regret. She hadn't seen him in months. She wondered if he had asked about her in his final days, if he had missed her as much as she missed him. Then came the question that twisted her heart: should she even go to the funeral? The thought of facing her relatives again, their sharp tongues and cold stares, made her stomach knot. She imagined Aunt Efua's voice, loud and mocking, "Why is she here?" But as the night stretched on, her decision became clear. This wasn't about them. This wasn't about the past. She wouldn't be going to win anyone's approval or prove anything. She would go for one reason only, to say goodbye to the man who had been her anchor in a world that often felt like it was against her. And so, with tears drying on her cheeks, Amina whispered into the darkness, "I'll be there, Grandpa. I'll come to you one last time." The sun was hot that afternoon when Amina stepped through the tall gates of the family compound. The place looked just as she remembered: wide courtyard, freshly painted walls, and the big mango tree her grandfather had planted years ago. But the moment her feet touched the ground, she felt the weight of every pair of eyes on her. Some relatives stared openly, others pretended not to look but whispered to the person next to them. The air was thick with judgment. She could hear small bursts of laughter, the kind that wasn't friendly. Every step she took felt like walking through a room full of thorns. It didn't take long for Aunt Efua to appear. She stood in the middle of the courtyard, hands on her hips, her voice carrying across the space. "What is she doing here?" she demanded, as if Amina were a stranger who had wandered into the wrong house. "The girl we kicked out has the nerve to show her face at this funeral." Some people turned to watch, waiting for Amina to answer, but she didn't. She kept her head down and walked past, clutching a small bunch of fresh white flowers in her hand. The murmurs followed her like a shadow as she made her way to the graveyard at the back of the compound. Her grandfather's grave was simple but beautiful, the fresh soil still dark and damp. Amina knelt down slowly, her knees pressing into the earth. She laid the flowers gently, her hands trembling. She didn't speak. Her heart was too heavy for words. Instead, she closed her eyes and let her memories of him speak for her. The sound of voices from the courtyard drifted over, but she stayed there a while, letting her tears fall quietly. It didn't matter who was watching, this was her moment with him. Later, as the guests began to leave, someone announced that the reading of the will would take place the next day. The news spread quickly, sparking fresh whispers and curious glances. Amina said nothing, but deep inside, she felt a strange unease. She had no expectations. After all, she had nothing to lose, or so she thought. The next afternoon, the living room of the family estate was packed. Every seat was taken, and those who couldn't find a chair stood along the walls. The air felt heavy, not with grief, but with expectation. People sat up straight, eyes bright, waiting to hear their names attached to houses, land, or bank accounts. At the front of the room, behind a polished wooden table, sat the elderly lawyer, Mr. Ababio. His voice was calm, his movements slow and deliberate as he took out a large brown envelope, sealed with red wax. All eyes followed his hands as he broke the seal and unfolded the thick sheets of paper inside. "I, Kofi Mensah," he began, his voice carrying through the silent room, "being of sound mind, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament." The first few items were small, a plot of farmland to one cousin, a pickup truck to another. Every time a name was called, the person would straighten with pride, some even exchanging smug glances. Aunt Efua received an old warehouse in the market district and beamed as though she had just won the lottery. Amina sat near the back, her hands resting quietly in her lap. She didn't look at anyone, didn't expect anything. This was their world, their property. She was just here to see the end of it. Mr. Ababio kept reading, his voice steady, until the list of smaller gifts was done. Then, he paused, the room shifted, people leaned forward, sensing that the most important part was coming. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. Finally, he said slowly, "The remainder of my estate." A hush fell over the room, so quiet you could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock. Every eye was locked on him, every breath held. Including the main family estate, all adjoining lands, all business interests, and remaining bank accounts. His eyes lifted briefly from the paper, scanning the room. And then, with a calm firmness that made the words land like thunder, he read, "I leave to my beloved granddaughter, Amina Kofi Mensah." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and unreal. "To my beloved granddaughter, Amina Kofi Mensah. I leave everything, the estate, the land, the businesses, the bank accounts." For a moment, the room was completely silent. You could almost hear hearts beating faster. Then, all at once, gasps filled the space like a wave crashing against the shore. Heads turned sharply toward Amina, some in disbelief, others in pure anger. Aunt Efua shot to her feet, her voice shaking with rage. "What nonsense is this? She's not even part of this family anymore. We threw her out. She has no right to anything." Her words were sharp enough to cut glass, but Amina stayed still, her eyes fixed on the lawyer, her face unreadable. Mr. Ababio did not flinch. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a smaller folder. With slow, steady hands, he laid a set of documents on the table for all to see. "This," he said, his tone calm but firm, "is proof. Amina Kofi Mensah is the legal granddaughter of the late Kofi Mensah, his only direct descendant on his daughter's side. She is also the sole executor of his estate." The murmurs grew louder. Some relatives leaned forward to read the papers, others sank back into their chairs, stunned. And, Mr. Ababio continued, glancing briefly at Amina before reading again, "The late Kofi Mensah updated his will after she was expelled from this house that he stated clearly, in his own words, that her kindness, humility, and integrity were the reasons she was the only one he trusted to inherit everything he had built." A few people scoffed, others avoided looking at her, shame creeping into their faces. Aunt Efua's mouth opened as if to argue again, but no words came out. Amina's hands were clasped in her lap, her heart pounding. She hadn't come here expecting anything, and now she was being told she owned it all. She could feel the weight of every stare on her, but she didn't gloat, didn't smile. Inside, a storm of emotions swirled, shock, gratitude. The day after the will reading, the entire atmosphere in the family compound shifted. Yesterday, Amina had been the girl they kicked out. Today, she was the owner of everything they had once controlled, the house, the land, the businesses, the money. It was as if the air itself had changed. Relatives who couldn't even look at her before were suddenly all smiles. Cousins she hadn't spoken to in years came over with warm greetings, acting as if they had always been close. Aunt Efua appeared at her door with a plate of jollof rice, her voice sweet like honey. "Amina, my dear, we were just misunderstood, she said, trying to touch her hand. But Amina saw through it all. She wasn't cold, but she wasn't fooled either. She thanked them politely, listened quietly, and kept her distance. She wasn't here to settle old scores or throw their past cruelty in their faces, but she made it clear in her calm, steady way that things would not go back to how they were. Her first step was with the staff, the cooks, cleaners, and drivers who had been shouted at and underpaid for years now worked directly under her. She called them together in the courtyard, speaking with warmth and respect. From today, she told them, you will be treated with fairness, you will be paid properly. This estate is not just mine, it will be a place where people are valued. Some of the workers had tears in their eyes. They knew what it meant for someone in her position to speak like that. The family watched from the sidelines, a mix of resentment and curiosity on their faces. They were waiting for her to slip, to fail, to lose control, but Amina didn't waver. She moved through the estate with quiet authority, her grandfather's photograph in her room reminding her of the kind of leader he had been. In just a few days, the power that had once been used to intimidate and exclude was now being used to build trust and dignity, and everyone, family and staff alike, was beginning to understand that the days of fear and favoritism were over. It didn't take long before Aunt Efua showed her true colors. One afternoon, she marched into Amina's office in the main house, her voice already raised. I have lived in that guest house for years, she said, her hands on her hips. You can't just take it away from me. I deserve a share of this inheritance. Amina listened quietly, her expression calm. She opened the top drawer of her desk and pulled out an envelope. This, she said softly, sliding it across the table, is your notice to vacate the guest house within 30 days. Efua's eyes widened. What? You can't be serious. I'm very serious, Amina replied. Grandpa left the estate to me, and I will run it in a way that is fair. That guest house will be used for visiting teachers and doctors who come to help the village. You have your own means. You don't need it. For the first time, Aunt Efua had no words. She snatched the envelope, muttering under her breath, and stormed out. But Amina's plans for the estate were bigger than family drama. Within weeks, she donated a large sum to the village orphanage, enough to repair the roof, buy new beds, and feed the children for months. She also funded the local school, paying for textbooks, uniforms, and even a small computer lab. The news spread quickly through Kumbele Village. People who had once pitied her now looked at her with deep respect. Shopkeepers greeted her warmly, mothers blessed her as she passed, and children ran up to wave and thank her. Despite her new wealth, Amina didn't change her way of life. She still spoke humbly, still walked through the market without acting above anyone, still remembered the nights she had walked alone in the rain. To the villagers, her generosity was more than charity, it was proof that power and kindness could exist in the same person. And in a place where people rarely forgot a scandal, they now spoke of her as the young woman who rose above it all and chose to give back. The evening was quiet, the golden light of sunset spilling through the tall windows of the main house. Amina sat in her grandfather's old armchair, the one that still smelled faintly of his cologne. In her hands was his framed photograph, his kind eyes, his warm smile, the way he always seemed to be looking right at her. She brushed her thumb across the glass and whispered, her voice soft but steady, "You believed in me when no one else did. I hope I make you proud, Grandpa." For a long moment, she just sat there, letting the silence wrap around her. The room felt full of his presence, as if he were sitting beside her, nodding in quiet approval. From outside, she heard footsteps on the gravel path and faint voices. Through the open window, she could see some of the very relatives who had thrown her out months ago. Now, their faces were polite, their greetings respectful, almost careful. "Good evening, Amina," they called, with smiles that didn't quite hide their unease. She gave them a small nod, nothing more. She wasn't interested in revenge, and she didn't need their approval anymore. Her eyes drifted back to the photograph. In her mind, she could still feel the cold rain of that night she had been forced out, her small bag in hand, neighbors whispering that she deserved it. The memory no longer hurt, it only reminded her how far she had come. A faint smile curved her lips. She had risen, not by becoming like them, but by holding on to the kindness and dignity her grandfather had taught her. And that, she knew, was the greatest victory of all.